Okay, I will start first of all by thanking Stephen for including me in this wonderful seminar that we're having. I think this is a great idea to give us a chance to get to know one another and participate in discussions. I want to thank Mike for the wonderful stories he told about those odd Bibles. There's a lot of them out there. When I do Bible exhibits, one of my favorite programs to give is one that I entitle, "Is That Really in the Bible?" And I go back to those personal translations, private translations, and pull out things that are so amusing. It's just a different world. And I especially want to thank my friend Guy. I can play a Bach fugue on the organ, but I cannot send Facebook messages. So Guy helped me tremendously putting together the slides, the photos that will come along with the presentation I'll be doing. When I began my collection of English Bibles over 50 years ago, a section of English and Scottish Psalters was not a choice. It was a requirement, since the book of Psalms had always been a central part of my Christian experience. As a young child, the first book of scripture I learned to find with ease was the book of Psalms, because it is at the very middle of the Bible. All I had to do was let the Bible fall open at its heart, and there it was, ready to sing to me of a mighty God, a loving and caring shepherd, a Lord of righteousness and repentance and redemption. At the dawn of the Reformation, one of the requirements of the Protestant churches was that the Bible be translated into the language of the people. The three leaders in the early history of the Protestant movement, Luther in Germany, Calvin in Geneva, and Zwingli in Zurich, each recognized the power of music to underscore liturgy, transform theology, and propel congregational worship. Several English and Scottish Protestants began to experiment with composing metrical psalms. A substantial fragment of the Psalter was versified by a servant in the royal Tudor courts named Thomas Sternhold, who bore the title Groom of the King's Robes. By the time of his death in 1549, Sternhold had completed 30 psalm versions, but congregational singing was still more than a decade away. Those of you who have English Bibles from the 16th and 17th century most likely have copies with an additional volume bound in at the back entitled The Whole Book of Psalms, translated into English meter by Thomas Sternhold, John Hopkins, and others, conferred with the Hebrew with apt notes to sing them withal. This Psalter later became known as the Old Version and remained in use with minor language modifications until the 19th century. Queen Elizabeth was ready to authorize it for use in the worship of the Church of England. Her only complaint was that some of the tunes, which she aptly referred to as Geneva jigs, were too catchy for use in worship, but the enthusiasm for singing the Psalms superseded her complaints, and the Old Version found its way into the hearts of English congregations. The only setting from the Old Version that is still sung today with very little change is William Keith's paraphrase of Psalm 100. William Keith joined the exiles at Geneva in 1556 and was one of the translators of the Geneva Bible. It is through these words from Psalm 100, expressing God's praise, that we know him best today. All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice. Him serve with fear, his praise forth tell. Come ye before him and rejoice. The Scots had always wanted to preserve an independent identity from their English cousins, and those who had fled to the continent with the English refugees under Bloody Mary were reluctant to authorize the identical Psalter the English Protestants approved in 1562. In the first Scottish Psalter, completed in 1564, much revision to the Anglican settings was made by Scottish poets and ministers, and about a third of the Anglican versions were replaced with the work of Scottish writers. The setting of Psalm 27 in the Scottish Psalter was also composed by William Keith and is a much better paraphrase than the one by Englishman John Hopkins included in the Old Version. The imagery is basically the same, but Keith's text is a more accurate expression of what the psalmist intended. The Lord my light and health will be, for what then should I be dismayed? My strength and life also is he. Of whom then should I be afraid? When Elizabeth ascended the throne, she named Matthew Parker her Archbishop of Canterbury. When so many Protestants had fled to Geneva, Parker remained in England, hiding out in the countryside and composing his own metrical version of the Psalms. With the return of the Geneva refugees and their Psalter, Parker realized that his version could never compete with it, so he had only a few copies privately printed in 1567 to give to friends and people in high places. Archbishop Parker's paraphrase of Psalm 100 is perhaps one of the best examples of his worst poetry. What poet ever won acclaim for writing a hymn with a rhyme scheme of A for 5 distinct verses? O joy, all men terrestrial, rejoice in God celestial. I bid not Jews especial, but Jews and Greeks in general. The Puritans were the first to show dissatisfaction with the old version, not for its poetic shortcomings, but because for their taste it was too free an adaptation of the Hebrew text. Fortunately for them, Henry Ainsworth, the pastor of the English Reformed Church in the Netherlands, was a Hebrew scholar who strongly believed in singing the Psalms in worship. In 1612, Ainsworth published 2 translations of the Psalms, one in prose accompanied by a commentary, and the other a version in meter. His singing Psalms came to America with Ainsworth's own congregation, known as the Pilgrims, in 1620. While Ainsworth's paraphrase of the 23rd Psalm isn't too poetic in its English, its relation to the Hebrew is strong from the beginning, where the name Jehovah is used for the Lord. Jehovah feedeth me, I shall not lack. In grassy folds he down doth make me lie. He gently leads me quiet waters by. He doth return my soul for his name's sake. In paths of justice leads me quietly. The years 1625 to 1660 were critical in the lives of the Scots and the English who shared the common kingdom of Great Britain, especially in the growing controversy between their respective Anglican and Presbyterian churches. One of the pivotal points was the decision of King Charles I and William Laud, his Archbishop of Canterbury, to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church. Convinced that a new version of the Psalms attributed to King James, but in reality a commissioned version by Sir William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, would secure acceptance of the prayer book, they prominently bound with the new liturgy the Psalms of King David, translated by King James. Their plan did not succeed, but prompted riots in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh the day it was introduced. This sparked a broader conflict, which ended with the beheading of King Charles in 1648 and the takeover of Parliament and the Commonwealth by Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans, and the Presbyterians. The Psalm version prepared by Sir William Alexander for the Scottish Prayer Book was equal in quality to the previous Old Version and the Scottish Psalter, but because it was attached to the imposed liturgy, its true prominence was never realized. His paraphrase of the first Psalm serves as a good example of his poetic prowess. The man is blessed who to walk in the ungodly counsel hates, and stands not in the sinner's way, nor sits in scorn of seats. But in the Lord's most holy law he hath his whole delight, and in his law doth meditate devoutly day and night. George Sandys was one of the most interesting figures of the early English literary period. As a colonial leader, adventurer, and treasurer in Virginia, he did considerable work with poetry, becoming America's first poet. In 1637, Sandys published his paraphrase of the Psalms, proclaimed by leading literary critics as the most perfect example of English psalmody ever composed. They were convinced that his texts were too good to be sung by ordinary people sitting in the pews. Sandys' version of Psalm 46 is a good example of his poetic meter and imagery. His imagery is inspiring, and his choice of certain words and phrases, dangers threaten to devour, chill our blood, foaming billows, horrid noise, add to our imagination of who this defensive God is. God is our refuge, our strong tower, securing by his mighty power when dangers threaten to devour. Thus armed, no fear shall chill our blood, though earth no longer steadfast stood and shook the hills into the flood. The New World figured prominently in the next influential version of the Psalms in meter. The Base Psalm book, the first book printed in America in 1640, was a new version paraphrased by the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony shortly after arriving in the New World. They sought to replace Henry Ainsworth's Psalter, which the Pilgrims had brought to the colonies, with a new version more faithful to the Hebrew. The Base Psalm book became popular through much of the 18th century and reflected the courage and creativity exhibited by the colonists. For me, their rendering of the 23rd Psalm strongly voices their commitment. The order of the words in the opening lines speaks that determination, not I shall not want, but won't therefore shall not I. The Lord to me a shepherd is, won't therefore shall not I. He in the folds of tender grass doth make me down to lie. While the Base Psalm book was establishing itself as a viable option to the old version in the New World, there was a considerable drive towards a new Psalter for the Scottish Church. Proposals were made to the General Assembly in 1648, and the new authorized version was adopted and published in 1650. With very few alterations, many of the psalm versions from this authorized collection have been preserved and sung for over 350 years. And one of the most widely acclaimed settings is the anonymous rendering of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by. And at the end, goodness and mercy all my life will surely follow me, and in God's house forevermore my dwelling place will be. One of the least expected authors of a paraphrase of the Psalms was Thomas Lord Fairfax, who in the mid-1600s served as commander-in-chief of the British Army under King Charles I, and was one of the prominent officials who appealed to Parliament to spare the king's life, an argument which he lost. After King Charles was beheaded, Fairfax became commander-in-chief of the Commonwealth Army under Oliver Cromwell, a post he held until he retired to his family's country estate, where he spent the rest of his life writing poetry and paraphrasing the Psalms, which have never been published. In 1669, he went through his rough manuscript of the Psalms, which is now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and wrote out a neater copy of those he thought his best efforts to leave with his family after his death in 1671. Several years ago, my friend and fellow ISBC member, Dave Lockman, whom I consider the world's leading Bible broker, emailed me from England that he had visited a shop in Manchester, which specialized in military memorabilia, and found Lord Fairfax's manuscript of his Psalms, which they apparently had shelved for quite a long time. Apparently, no one interested in Psalm books ever shopped in a military store, and no one browsing there was interested in purchasing a poetic version of the Psalms by a soldier. He negotiated a very reasonable price and brought the book home with him for me. A critic over a century ago said that Lord Fairfax was not a poet, but rather a man of poetic taste, an admirer of verse. His literary shortcomings are evident in his setting of Psalm 23, which is a fine expression of his faith. How can I want, since, Lord, thou seems me to green pastures leads, by brooks of waters gently streams, and soul refreshing shade. Thy way of truth and justice both his equal hand doth guide. This for his own name's sake he doth such care his to provide. The 17th century came to a close with the publication of a paraphrase of the Psalms designed to replace the old version of Sternhol and Hopkins, which remained for the next 150 years the official Psalter of the Church of England. Its authors were Nahum Tate, the poet laureate of England, and Nicholas Brady, a parish priest in London. By far the more prominent partner was Nahum Tate, praised for his learning, candor, wit, and modesty. In addition to his poetry, he wrote several dramatic productions and revised Shakespeare's works to improve them. So much for his modesty. In reality, he was a man of intemperate and improvident life and died in poverty in 1715. Nicholas Brady was a native of Ireland who served as chaplain to the king and established a reputation as a politician, a preacher, and a poet. The first edition of the Psalm Paraphrases by Tate Brady appeared in 1696 and was not well recognized. The original setting of the 23rd Psalm began by having the congregants refer to themselves as worthless charges, which was not a very flattering image. Since God does me, his worthless charge, protect with tender care, as watchful shepherds guard their flocks, what can I want or fear? Tate Brady began a second edition published in 1698, which contained many more new texts than revisions. Because of its tremendous success, it became known as the New Version. Their second rendering of Psalm 23 discarded the negative image of a worthless charge and replaced it with a stronger image of God being our mighty Lord, guide, and shepherd, caring for us and providing everything we need. The Lord himself, the mighty Lord, vouchsafes to be our guide, the shepherd by whose constant care my wants are all supplied. Cotton Mather's Psalterium Americanum, the second American version of the Psalms written to be sung in worship, was the work of Cotton Mather, best known for his role in the Salem witchcraft trials. He was a congregational minister and one of the most famous New England clergymen of his day. He was the grandson of Richard Mather, one of the authors of the original bass psalm book, and published his Psalterium Americanum in 1718 as a preferred alternative to his grandfather's work. It was the first paraphrase of the Psalms in blank verse and was so poorly received that it was never reprinted. The lack of a rhyme sequence, along with the use of certain uncommon words like tranquilities, fetch, benignity, and sabotage, becomes quite obvious in Mather's setting of the 23rd Psalm. My shepherd is the eternal God, I shall not be in any want. In pastures of a tender grass, he ever makes me to lie down. To waters of tranquilities, he gently carries me along. My feeble and my wandering soul, he kindly does fetch back again. One of the main complaints of those congregations who sang only the Psalms was that it was quite difficult and sometimes impossible to celebrate fully the Christian seasons of the year and the ministry and teachings of Jesus Christ through the singing of Old Testament Psalms alone. Congregations were forced to read between the lines to add fulfillment to prophecy. A new vision of how the Psalms speak to us in our Christian experience found its first advocate in Isaac Watts, who in 1719 published his Psalms of David, imitated in the language of the New Testament. One phrase in the title page of Watts's Psalter summarizes well his intent, imitated in the language of the New Testament. He became the bridge between the singing of Old Testament Psalms and hymns reflective of the gospel message, earning the title, the Father of English Hymnody. His setting of Psalm 90 is more subtle in its gospel interpretation than many of his other verses, but it speaks well of the ancient God of our creation and the contemporary God through Jesus, who is our hope for years to come. Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast and our eternal home. Watts' setting of Psalm 98, again, does not mention Jesus by name, but we can't help but think of his true subject when we sing these words every Christmas. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let heaven and earth prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. In his version of Psalm 72, Watts goes a step further in his New Testament interpretation and refers to Jesus by name, taking the Old Testament text beyond the Hebrew imagery of those of who we believe is the Lord of all. Jesus shall reign where the sun doth his successive journeys run. His kingdom stretch from shore to shore till moon shall wax and wane no more. Not all of what this psalm text speak to us today in the same way he intended, and that is the risk of poets writing in a language like English that is constantly evolving, adding new words and interpreting old imagery in old terms which have become archaic over the years. An example I'm a bit hesitant to share with you, and you'll see why, is his setting of Psalm 41, which was intended to exalt the love, charity, and goodwill faithful Christians feel and express from the depths of their own hearts when they see that the Lord holds them likewise in his deepest inner being. Blessed is the man whose bowels move and melt with pity to the poor, whose soul by sympathizing love feels what his fellow saints endure. His heart contrives for their relief more good than his own hands can do. He in the time of general grief shall find the Lord has bowels too. Most of the psalm settings and hymns by Charles Wesley and his brother John appeared in small pamphlets, which they took with them on their evangelical missions. This collection here, printed in 1794, is a single example of their revival resources, which can be tailored for the theme or the crowd of the day. The first collected edition of Charles Wesley's Psalms appeared in 1854 and brought all of his settings together. For Charles, the most important element in all of his writing was his life in God and Christ, his experience of the one of whom he then wrote. The presence of Jesus permeates the Psalms and brings them to a strong Christian substance. His setting of Psalm 23 is a prime example of this merging of the Testaments. Jesus, the good shepherd, is. Jesus died the sheep to save. He is mine and I am his. All I want in him I have, life and health and rest and food, all the plenitude of God. Perhaps no other single pastor in New England enjoyed the well-deserved respect for every aspect of his ministry, including his literary skills, as Thomas Prince, for whom Princeton was named. He graduated from Harvard in 1707 and spent much of the next decade traveling in Europe, preaching in a number of churches, and returned to Boston in 1717, where he served as pastor of the Old South Church until his death in 1758. Knowing the place that the Bay Psalm book held for over a century, Prince decided to make an attempt at revising and improving the poetry to make it more meaningful a century after it was written. In 1758, the year of his death, was published in Boston the Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs of the Old and New Testament, faithfully translated into English meter. Psalm 42 presents a good comparison of the original Bay Psalm book text, taken from the 1762 Boston printing, beside Prince's revision of the same psalm, but it's not really evident which is the superior paraphrase. The Bay Psalm book, which is on the right, begins this way: like as the panting heart doth bray after the water brooks, even in such wise, O God, my soul after thee panting looks. Prince's revision on the left side improves that somewhat, but we can't really tell which is best. As the chaste heart with vehemence pants for the cooling brooks, so pants my soul for thee, O God, for thee so longing looks. Changes in the church in the 19th century to give more emphasis to the New Testament than the Old progressed, and the revival movement begun with the Wesleys, flourished with a generation of evangelists who traveled about preaching the good news and winning souls to the church. A new category of congregational song, the gospel hymn, emerged and the singing of psalms declined. The first complete Bible to be translated by a woman didn't appear until 1876, when Julia Evelina Smith self-published her own version. It grew out of her passion for scripture, but in the 19th century, women were not thought to be capable of such a project. The same challenge was faced almost 50 years earlier, in 1828, when Margaret Petullo became the first woman to paraphrase the entire book of Psalms. She was an older lady who lived in Perth, Scotland, and as part of her daily devotional study focused on the Psalms, and wrote metrical paraphrases of the Old Testament Psalms with a New Testament sentiment. The story goes that when she had completed all 150 Psalms, she took her manuscript to church and passed it along to her pastor, asking him to read through them and suggest any improvements she might make. As he perused her work, he realized that the poetry was not especially good, and with the aim of not having to confront her, he tucked the volume in an office cabinet and hoped she would forget about it. A few years passed, and one Sunday after worship, she asked for her Psalms back. As the minister handed them to her, he said, "I am so sorry, but there's nothing I can do to improve this," meaning that she should just start over. But she interpreted it to mean that it was so good, there was nothing he, as a Scots Presbyterian minister, well acquainted with the Psalms, could do to make it better. Elated, she paid to have enough copies printed privately to give to her friends and to stock the bookstores in Glasgow and Edinburgh. As her friends read through her text, they became aware that the quality was questionable and went to the bookstores, bought every copy they could find and destroyed them, lest a newspaper critic get a copy and write a scathing review. Margaret went to her grave thinking that her psalm texts were so good, her minister couldn't improve them, and all of the printed copies had sold out in her native land. Her setting of Psalm 84 is a prime example of the quality of her poetry in both the vocabulary and the imagery she employed. Even the grammar, "How lovely is thy courts," for example, leaves a lot to be desired. "O God of hosts, the Lord of grace, how lovely is thy courts. In temple of thy dwelling place, how numerous are thy forts." Obviously, her settings were never reprinted, and since most copies were destroyed by her dear friends, Margaret Petullo's Christian Psalter is one of the more difficult versions to acquire. Several other psalm collections appeared, primarily the Psalter hymnal of the Christian Reformed Church in America. More recently, Psalms for All Seasons, published by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship in 2012, and Timeless, Ancient Psalms for the Church Today, a work still in progress through the Austin Graduate School of Theology. There are 4 complete or almost complete Psalters by contemporary writers I will highlight as I close. In 1986, Christopher Weber, an Episcopal priest, published his New Metrical Psalter. His was the first attempt in many years by an individual at providing a metrical version. Only the lectionary psalms were included. The same year saw an effort in the Presbyterian Church to restore psalm singing. One of its ministers, Fred Anderson, had composed some metrical psalms for use of his congregation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He was later called to Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City, and in 2016 published his book, Singing God's Psalms, Metrical Psalms and Reflections for Each Sunday in the Church Year, which contains paraphrases for most of the Psalms set to familiar tunes. A wonderful collection of all 150 Psalms in meter and set to familiar tunes appeared in 2006. It was the work of Martin Leckbush, an English native who holds degrees not in theology or creative writing, but in mathematics and numerical analysis, and works in information technology. Perhaps it was through that link with what's going on in the world that inspired his interest in hymn writing, committing himself to equipping the church for Christian living. My own collection of settings of all 150 Psalms, entitled The Psalter for Christian Worship, was inspired by a request from my pastor at Central Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, where I served as organist, for me to compose metrical settings of the Eastertide Psalms in 1995. We had talked much about restoring psalm singing in our Reformed worship, and this was a great opportunity to set that project in motion. Inspired by the enthusiasm of the congregation, I worked through the summer, and at our weekly worship staff meeting the week before Labor Day, I handed the minister a notebook containing about 165 versions of all 150 Psalms. In closing, let me share with you my setting of Psalm 118, designated by the lectionary to be the Psalm for Easter Sunday. My approach was to be faithful to the Hebrew text, but to help my Christian congregation read between the lines to sing of Christ's resurrection and redemption for us all. Give thanks unto our gracious God, whose love endures forever. The Lord our strength and song shall be, from whom no fault can sever. Sing mighty songs of victory, both now and for eternity, for God will leave us never. I shall not die, but I shall live and sing God's grace with elation. Though I deserve no more than death, God blesses me with salvation. The gate that should unyielding be is open wide to welcome me. Give thanks and adoration. Upon the stones the builders judge, imperfect, weak, and tender. Now rest the corners of God's house, still unsurpassed in splendor. This is the day the Lord has made. God is my sun and God my shade. Rejoice and praise gladly render. In most Bible versions, the book of Psalms entreats us never to cease to sing new songs to the Lord. And so many faithful poets over the centuries have helped us to keep that divine instruction alive in our worship. Whether we sing beautiful notes or make joyful noises, we proclaim who God is, who we are, and the ties that bind us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I was very much enjoyed your presentation. I was taking notes again.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
I got to look up some of those. Anyway, want to open now. If anyone has questions they'd like to offer or ask Michael, I'm sure he will do his best to give good answers. So remember to unmute first, but anyone who'd like to give Michael a question, have at it.
Hey, Michael, I have a question. This is
Okay.
Sean Finney.
Yes, I recognize you.
Yeah, of course.
And your family.
Yeah. It's my wife, Sue, and daughter, April.
Yes.
So I remember, Michael, having read several years ago that Luther, and you made reference to Luther and Calvin and Zwingli as noting that the power of the Psalms. And I know that Luther, of course, was a hymnist as well. A mighty fortress is our God, and so forth. Did he do any settings for the Psalter as well, Michael?
He did a number of settings that are included. He didn't do a complete Psalter, but included some psalm paraphrases in his collection of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs that they're not all as sung as widely as A Mighty Fortress, which is the Psalm 46, which so well set the stage for the Reformation that he began. But there are other psalms that are paraphrased in his text. I don't have my resources with me here. I'm actually at my friend Guy's, since he knew how to work both computers. But I will look at that and send you the titles of some of Luther's psalms.
I'd be interested. Yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting the way those three supporters of Reformation differed in their views of the Psalms in worship, singing the Psalms in worship. Luther felt that music was a fair and glorious gift of God, and that the Psalms could very well help steer the congregation in the right direction. They could inspire the congregation to interpret the Bible in different ways, and to where they felt change needed to be made, to instigate that change. Zwingli, on the other hand, recognized the power of music, but music frightened him. He was afraid that music would be a very negative force in the worship of the church, and therefore would not allow any congregational singing. Organs were removed from churches, no choirs could sing, and music was literally pushed out the door by Zwingli at the beginning. On the other hand, Calvin, through the French Reformed Church in Geneva, believed strongly in the power of music to add to worship. And he felt like the only songs that were fit for us to offer back to God in our worship were the songs that God had given to us, namely the Psalms. So he expanded that view a little bit and allowed metrical paraphrases of the Psalms to be used. And it was that French Protestant Psalter that inspired the English and Scottish Protestants who went to Geneva and experienced psalm singing in Calvin's church there to complete their version and bring it back and have it allowed by Queen Elizabeth and the English church to be.
Down, maybe.
We seem to have lost Michael's connection.
Become a part of it.
We lost Michael there. We lost you there for a minute, Michael. I think you're back.
Okay.
Any other questions for Michael? Anything else? Ron, you're muted. Ron Davis, you need to unmute yourself.
I had a question for Michael. I was wondering if his Psalter is in print. Is it available?
Yes, it's available. It's printed by Westminster John Knox Press.
I saw that, yes.
It's a Presbyterian church. If you will shoot me an email, I get copies for half price. Shoot me an email just with your name and address, and I will send any of you a complimentary copy.
Okay.
I will do a commercial, if I may, for Michael's version of the Psalms. I find that they're very useful. I often will pull his version for a Wednesday prayer meeting I have, and will often do my best to sing them. They are very singable to very familiar tunes. So I find it to be a wonderful resource, and would recommend that anybody take Michael up on his offer. If you don't have Michael's email, you can send your emails to me if you got them, and then I can forward them to Michael. So
That would be fine.
that way we don't have to worry about trying to publish Michael's email on this meeting and stuff like that, but send it to me and I'll make sure Michael gets it.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hey, Michael, thank you. Really enjoyed that. So selfishly again, hey, I want to see some journal articles coming in the Bible Review Journal. So too lengthy for one article, and especially the pictures are great. But again, something like, the beginnings, or maybe more the, recent Psalms or something like that, which then we get a chance to plug your own book in there, because many people don't know about your book or your effort. So I'm really like that. But so I maybe can talk to you later about that. So I'm thinking journal article. Okay. 3. But the thing I have a question for is, so you mentioned Margaret Petullo, 1828, and precedes Julia Smith, 1876. Actually, I remember coming across someone, a female from like 1802 or 1803, maybe even before then, who did either Psalms and probably more likely Job. Does anyone in the group, I think she might have been the very first person, very first female to produce a Bible book translation. I think it was Job. Does anyone have a name?
Have a name or even a part of a title, that would be helpful.
I can find that. I mean, I can do it myself.
I think you're right. There were several books, and Job, I think, was probably one of them, that were done by women. But the complete Psalter, there were a number of partial Psalters done. Some women poets published, maybe 10 Psalms with their other poems. But Margaret was the first complete book of Psalms, but there were some women before who had done biblical translation. Yeah, you're right.
That's good information. Very intriguing. So anyway, thank you. I got some more information because of that.
Can I call up a Word document?
One Maybe familiar with Michael is
I don't know what to.
Mary Lee Chudley.
I'm sorry.
Mary Lee Chudley, who did Psalms on several occasions, together with the Song of the Three Children, paraphrased by Mary Chudley in 1703. So she did
Wow.
Psalm 15 and stuff like that. I know Mike is going to take notes too.
That's a new one for me, I think.
I'll send you information.
Please do, yeah. Of course, so many of these, as Mike was saying earlier, are hard to find because they were privately printed. Many times, whoever the author was would have 100, 200 copies printed at their own expense and give them away or sell them to friends or members of their own congregations or their own seminaries or universities. And a lot of the books like this by independent translators are quite hard to find.
I wanted to share
Oh,
in my little book because you mentioned the Wesleys and they were, leaders of the revival and their hymns are so well known.
yes.
And their father was a poet, Samuel Wesley. And I found this, I work at Wonder Book and I found this little shabby thing at Wonder Book and I brought it home because it was published in 1743 and repaired it, restored it. And may I take just a minute to read one of the poems that their father wrote? He was so
Yes.
funny. It says, on the setting up of Mr. Butler's monument in Westminster Abbey, and this is a sampling of their father's wit, while Butler, needy wretch, was yet alive, no generous patron would a dinner give. See him, when starved to death and turned to dust, presented with a monumental bust. The poet's fate is here in emblems shown. He asked for bread and he received a stone.
That's great.
Just a little humor.
Anything else for Michael? I'm going to go ahead and stop this.
Hey, I have, wait,
Oh, go
Stephen,
ahead. Go
I
ahead.
did have a question for Michael. Michael, but it was from Michael Kuykendall.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, it was regarding the first name of the Fenton translation.
Barry
First
Fenton?
name. Fenton.
There are.
Yeah, Farrar or Ferrer, Ferrar.
Ferrar.
Mhm,
Ferrar.
mhm.
Ferrar. Okay, that's the question I had.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else before I was go ahead and stop the recording.